Political assassin lies and laughs all the way to the bank. And Australia is under military occupation. Coming up on this week's Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report. It's the 3rd of July 2025. I'm Robert Barwick. I'm joined today by Citizens Party writer and researcher Richard Bardon. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Robbie.
In this week's show, we are going to talk about the latest shameless example of, well, you generously call it soft corruption, but let's be honest, it's corruption. Another politician who's walked the revolving door to make money in the private sector from things that they were involved in as politicians. But this is the big one. This is the guy, we'll tell you about the guy who's gone to work for the most powerful force in the country. And what he, we'll insinuate what he did to get the job. And also we're going to do a continuation of what we discussed last week with in relation to Pine Gap, etc. But more details about what it means to have these military bases in Australia, where it's going. So we can show you where it's going, what the intention is, because the people behind it, they're being pretty open in their own forums about what it means. But first, remember, we need your help getting this message around. We're not just commentators, we're activists. The purpose of this show is to arm you with the information to be part of the fight to do something about it. And for the show, the way you can help with that is like it, share it on all the social media you can, subscribe if you're not a subscriber, and ring the bell icon to make sure you get notified of upcoming posts. Comment below, please. We value the feedback and we try and participate and respond as much as we can. And donate. There's a donate button below. The Citizens Party is the most uniquely funded political party in Australia. It's entirely from private individual Australian citizens, not other sources of money. And so for this operation to be as effective as it is, we have to have that support from the public. And if you can support, please do. All right, now, another little update before we get into the show proper. Last week, Richard and I touched briefly on the Antoinette Lattouf verdict, and Antoinette Lattouf it was actually covered by Media Watch this Monday as well, right? And the details on the Media Watch was really shameless. Just how shamelessly the ABC management gave in to this coordinated campaign by bullying lawyers who were pro-Israel, and they just would not tolerate having an alternative voice on ABC Media. And the real crime, though, was committed by the ABC management, who just gave into that. And so the ruling of the court was, this is pathetic, you have no right to give in to something like that. ABC staff members have the right to their political opinions.
And its own charter. It's a Commonwealth company. It has a charter, and that you can't just summarily dismiss people, and that's what they did. And so that even that would have been just.
Yeah. No, so this was the pro-Israel lobby in Australia flexing its muscles to try and this was December 2023. Yeah. So 2 months after October 7. Yeah. And already by then, as horrific as October 7 was, and the sense of mental shock we all felt when we heard about what had happened, already by then, 2 months later, Israel had eclipsed that. Because, I don't know if you can do a graph to show the body count, but there were so many bodies on the Palestinian side already, including, hundreds, if not thousands of children already, innocent civilians already just wholesale slaughtered, using October 7 as the excuse. And the criticism had started to mount, and they were determined to squash it, and it didn't work. Now, well, it did in the ABC, but now the wheels of justice move slowly, but sometimes they at least move. Now, one of the reasons we wanted to raise that is because this week there was another court ruling, which is fascinating, and I'll just give you, and one of the reasons the Citizens Party pays attention to this is because this relates to the slur of anti-Semitism. And the Citizens Party has often been accused of that completely groundlessly, but it's a slur that's designed to shut people up. And I want to mention a name here because this particular name has also used the slur against me. And his name's Peter Wertheim, and he's the boss of the Executive Council of Australian Jury. And back a little bit later in the show, we're going to talk about Christine Holgate and the Christine Holgate issue because it's very relevant to our show this week. At that time, when the Citizens Party alone of all the political parties in Australia took up the Christine Holgate issue and turned around public opinion, it was a lot of people who pay attention to how this works were really shocked at how we succeeded in doing that. And this bloke, Peter Wertheim from the Executive Council of Australian Jury, came out and attacked me, because I was very prominent, and the Citizens Party for our role in that, basically saying, oh, careful, they're anti-Semites. Right? That's what he said at the time. So this week he's done this, there was a court hearing that he and his organisation, the Executive Council of Australian Jury, took a Muslim preacher to the Human Rights Commission, no, that's the initial step. So it's gone to the actual court, federal court, right? So this is one of those racial vilification complaints. So the ruling was this week. Now the ruling found in favour of the Executive Council of Australian Jury because this Muslim preacher had said some pretty fiery things, and so the judge upheld their complaint because against the letter of the law as written doesn't mean, you should also understand that you've got to qualify. It's against the letter of the law as written. This guy was found guilty, right? But in the middle of this very lengthy ruling, the judge said something quite fundamental, and what he said frankly has huge implications for a big global debate. And in fact, let's define that first, Richard. So there's this thing, just explain, there's this thing called the International
Holocaust Remembrance Association, I believe it's called.
And they have a definition of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, so this is this Wertheim guy's organisation is one of the proponents of this view for a long time in Australia, that basically says that any criticism of the state of Israel or of the political ideology of Zionism, the idea that the world's Jews should go and colonise Palestine, and that's what the founders of Israel called it, colonisation of Palestine. They say any criticism of any of that is anti-Semitism, is preaching hatred of Jews as such.
Now this has been very disturbing ever since this definition has been pushed, because what anti-Semitism actually means, even though you can quibble about the name anti-Semitism because of the word Semite, it's not exclusive to Jews.
Yeah, it's just a general term for that.
But what
language cultures.
People tend to think it should mean is just hatred of Jews. Someone's a Jew, you hate them because they're a Jew, right? And this was very common in Eastern Europe and those sort of places, right? Not just Eastern Europe, Western Europe. There's a long history to Jewish hatred. That's different to people saying, "Hang on, we're not advocating hatred of Jews when we're criticising Israel's policies in the Middle East, right? We're talking about a state and what it's doing to other people, right? And that should not be included." But this was quite pernicious. So this has been a very effective campaign around the world to push this definition. It effectively brought the former leader of the UK Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, undone because they used that to define his and his supporters as anti-Semitic. And then out of the blue, this judge this week, despite upholding the Executive Council of Australian Jury's complaint, he added this in the middle. He goes, quote, "The ordinary reasonable listener would understand that not all Jews are Zionists or support the actions of Israel in Gaza, and that disparagement of Zionism constitutes disparagement of a philosophy or ideology and not a race or ethnic group. Needless to say, political criticism of Israel, however inflammatory or adversarial, is not by its nature criticism of Jews in general or based on Jewish, racial or ethnic identity. The conclusion that it is not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel is the corollary of the conclusion that to blame Jews for the actions of Israel is anti-Semitic. The one flows from the other. And that was the Australian Federal Court ruling this week. That is incredibly significant, and it has big implications for how this debate will play out going forward.
Including for a couple of other ongoing lawsuits launched by some of these same people against other journalists and commentators for...
Such as Mary Kostakidis in particular. And we talk about Mary pretty regularly on the show. All right, so that's by way of update. That's out of the way. Let's get on to the main story, which I'll just qualify this by saying we're going to talk about banks now. And we have been accused, like this anti-Semitism thing is so ridiculous. You know, I gave you the Peter Wertheim example. In that Christine Holgate campaign, there was a senator who actually said, the Citizens Party is anti-Semitic. That's why they talk about banks. You know this conspiracy about Jewish bankers?
I've had someone, a university academic, tell me that, when you say banks, you mean Jews. That's code for Jews. I said, well, that's funny. I would have thought that I knew what I meant by the words that I was saying that have these literal meanings that we explain in the article I was offering him to read, but never mind.
Oh dear. Anyway, so we're not talking about that. We're talking about banks. We're talking about banks, bastard banks, pure and simple. All right, let's get into it. Political assassin lies and laughs all the way to the bank. And we're going to talk about Simon Birmingham, the new CEO of the Australian Banking Association. But first, let's just recap on what banks are up to. I'm going to Canberra at the end of the month, and I've asked members of Parliament to meet me, and I've said we want to talk about this, and I made the point in the letter I emailed to these MPs. Look, the banks continue to treat customers appallingly, and we could sit here all day and go through that. But we'll give just a couple of examples that are quite pertinent at the moment. One is there's a lot of the banks have really ramped up their claim that they are getting on top of the scams question. Now, first of all, this is BSPR, two different words.
Two initialisms run
BS
together.
public relations, because everything you're hearing from the banks about scams is their way of getting out of the fact that there's pressure on them to copy the UK and just agree to pay for the losses of their customers from scams, right? Now, the UK banks do that, and our banks do not want to do it. Last time Elisa and I talked about this on the show, I think the figure was something like $2.5 billion in scam losses for that 12-month period. Well, that's a lot, right? But the bank's profits are $32 billion. So even if they had to pay to cover the scam losses, they can easily afford it, right? Those scam losses often destroy the people who've lost the money in the scams. And why are they? What's the number one reason people are exposed to online banking scams? Because the banks have pushed them into online banking.
Yeah, closed branches,
exactly.
Ripped out ATMs,
Yep.
Denied access to cash and face-to-face banking.
You don't have alternatives, so you got to do it. And then suddenly, Granny's getting a phone call, and you can watch videos of this. It's not like Granny gets a phone call from very sophisticated people who can speak English in places like India or whatever, and they put on an act where they get the poor person on the end of the phone to, fire up their computer, bring up online banking, etc., and then pulling a few tricks, they give them access to their online banking and they clean them out.
Yep.
Right, and that's what they're exposed to because of the way the banks are pushing them.
And just to note, part of the reason that the banks should be liable for these scams is because they underinvest in their own security systems, which is how these scammers often get hold of the basic information that gives them that foot in the door in the first place.
Yep. Well, and when you say underinvest, now as you know, Richard, I'm involved in some interesting ongoing meetings with people who are experts in these areas, and I have been given lots of examples of this underinvestment. The big banks in Australia still have computer systems that where the basis of it are 1960s mainframes operating COBOL, the old computer language, COBOL, Common Business Oriented Language or whatever it is. And so that's the basis and everything. And they've got all this new generation stuff just whacked on top of it, right? And there's at least one bank where there's a guy in his late 70s who the bank will not let him retire. They pay him close to $1 million a year just to be available for those times when the mainframe has problems. And he's the only codger they can call in and knows how to even talk to the damn thing, right? This is happening in an Australian bank right now. That guy stands between you and catastrophe. And, you know, they've made 32 around, their profit has been in the 30s in terms of billions for quite a long time now, right? So hundreds of billions of dollars in the last decade, you know, many hundreds more in the last 20 years. They could have taken a portion of that and really overhauled their systems. No, right? This really is underinvesting. Anyway, so, and what the banks are doing, when you're seeing all these announcements at the moment about new scam initiatives, anti-scam initiatives, they announce all these things, but the fine print is always the same, that the ultimate onus of the new system is still on the customer. And it's a way for the banks to say, look, we've given you all these steps, and if you still stuff up, it's on you.
Yep.
Right? We are not liable for anything.
And I read today that's coming into self-managed super now, because the banks are doing the same trick with these online platforms where you can go and select from this menu of investment vehicles that they're supposed to vet but don't. And even useless ASIC has been, you know, enticed out of its, like the old emphysemic guard dog finally coming out of its kennel, right? To give a few token woofs at these people. It was like, clean your act up, because it's the same thing. They're allowed to hump absolute crap out there, and it's on the customer to, you know, then they blame, as one of these consumer advocates said, buyer beware, blame the customer for buying it off the platform that you advertised it on.
Yeah.
Or sold space to someone else to advertise it on, which amounts to the same thing.
Now, which bank has the eagle? They do this stupid thing with the eagle comes and lands on your shoulder. I think it might be ANZ.
I don't know.
You're on and this eagle lands on your shoulder, and basically the eagle's pecking you in the ear. And if you still do it, if you ignore the eagle, it's on you. Right? This is what they're saying. All right, so that's one example. And until the kinds of things we're talking about change, right? The banks are just going to be allowing people to get ripped off, and they're claiming no liability here. The other one is branch closures. Now the branch closures is continuing, but we've got a new villain of bank branch closures, because one of the only concrete things to come out of the branch closures inquiry that again we led, finished a year ago, is Jim Chalmers announced at the end of last year that all 4 of the big 4 banks have signed on to a moratorium for 3 years of no regional branch closures. Right? Yeah. So Bendigo Bank comes along and says, hold my beer. Now, Bendigo Bank, this is quite extraordinary. Bendigo Bank, what are the ads for Bendigo at the moment? We might be able to you can have this playing in the background, please, producer, if it doesn't get us in trouble. Bendigo is running this campaign at the moment, the Better Big Bank. It wants to identify itself as a big bank. Now, think about that for a minute. Everyone hates the big banks. What is in the minds of the management of Bendigo Bank that they've decided, let's identify with that?
Yeah, rats usually jump off sinking ships.
But. Yeah, exactly. So Bendigo has just announced this week the closure of 10 regional branches. Bang, it's closing 10 of them. 9 of them are corporate branches. One of them in Queenstown and Tasmania is a community branch. Dale Webster, the journalist, points out that Bendigo has 70-odd corporate branches and 200 community branches. And Bendigo goes around saying, oh, see, we are maintaining, this is what they were doing up until this week at least anyway, saying we commit to our network, our regional network. We're maintaining our regional network in Australia. Well, not really, because the community branches, community banks, are entirely funded by the local communities. All Bendigo is the banker, right? Yeah. The people, the communities put up the capital, they hire or buy the premises, they pay the staff, right? This is all done by the community.
Yeah, all Bendigo's doing is supplying what they call the back end, the systems and the license, basically.
Now, the other thing with Bendigo is it's no longer providing community, there's no more community, but they're not opening them up anymore. When we did the branch closures inquiry, all these communities that were losing their last bank in town were so desperate, they all went to Bendigo Bank. Can we set up a community bank? Bendigo says no. So all these community banks that are in Australia, they go back to the 90s and the early 2000s, etc. That's when Bendigo was trying to manage differently and trying to, thinking, okay, we've got a marketing opportunity here, we're going to fill a niche, right? As you know, they weren't that great ever anyway.
Yeah, they were putting up the money and doing the back end work for these scams that people might remember, like Timber Corp, Great Southern. They were the bank of choice for that, and they were creating this cozy image of a community banks where we're your local friendly whatever. While corporate is in on some of the worst scams in the financial scams in Australian history. Yeah,
huge losses at that level. But that's what got them a good reputation. This community banking thing. A lot of people used to say to us at the time, "Oh, is Bendigo what you mean by a people's bank?" And we're going, "No. What we mean by a people's bank is a government-owned bank, right? That you can rely on under all circumstances." But anyway, Bendigo is buying all this goodwill. Now it's decided, well, we're going to be the better big bank, and it would seem, Richard, that the qualification to be a big bank is shut down your branches, right? And so this announcement of 10 branch closures in one fell swoop this week is quite extraordinary. And then I'm going to give you an example. We'll put the Facebook post up on the screen. I'm going to give you an example of how supremely arrogant they are. Two of them are in Gippsland. Two of these branches are in Gippsland. And so the local Member of Parliament, federal member of Parliament for Gippsland, Darren Chester, tried to go along to the community meeting about these branch closures.
Yeah, it's a town hall type thing.
Town hall type meeting. And Bendigo refused to let him in. They said, the Bendigo executive said they would not participate in the meeting if the local Member of Parliament was there. I mean, hang on, really? Right? Who should have more power in that situation?
Who's running this show?
Who's running this show? Well, why are the banks such bastards? Why do they get away with this? Because their number one asset, if you did an accounting of all the bank's assets in Australia, the number one asset of the banks is not on their books. It's called the uni party. They own the two major parties, lock, stock and barrel. And that's what brings us to Simon Birmingham. Because since 2017, the CEO of the Australian Banking Association has been a Labor politician, a senior Labor politician, Anna Bligh. And if long-term viewers of the show would have heard me more than once rant and rave about this woman and the way she has just gaslighted, and that's the proper term, gaslighted the Australian public as the chief cheerleader of the banks since 2017. And by gaslighting, I mean things like she was on radio the day before the very first hearing of the Senate inquiry into branch closures, and she's talking about the specific branches that were at issue in that first hearing down in Sale. And she says things like, the reason these branches are closing is because that's what the customers want. They don't want branches anymore.
You don't come to this branch anymore.
They don't want it.
So like, well, I was there last week. Maybe I was the only one. No, everyone was there. They just lied.
She says things like they're taking a leap into this new world of digital banking, right? This is what the customers want, and just spin after spin after spin, and the whole thing was exposed. Don't take my word for it. Read the final report of the branch closures inquiry, which basically, without saying it in as many words, every page should just say Anna Bligh is a liar. The amount of times I tweeted that, because I attended every hearing, and as I'm listening to these stories from the communities, case after, and I just kept tweeting, Anna Bligh should be made to come and sit in these hearings, proper eyes open with toothpicks and her ears open so she can't close them, right?
The Clockwork Orange thing,
right? Torture her that way, so that she can see what a liar she is, right? So that's what Anna Bligh, the Labor politician, was prepared to do. She's finishing up this year, and so who does the Banking Association seamlessly turn to be the new guy, Simon Birmingham? Now, turns out I was watching Parliament on the last sitting day of last year, and people may remember that it was an extraordinary day, the last sitting day of last year, because the Senate rammed through 40 bills in one day.
How many of them do you reckon they read? Never mind.
No, one. The one they read was the one that they got up and dropped, which was the mis and disinformation bill.
Yeah,
so the one procedure that day that was actually honest was the mis and disinformation bill, where the Labor politician got up and pulled it from the schedule because they had been forced to read that by the public. Of course, we were involved in that. Now, Jared Rennick on that day told me that they'd had to vote something like 180 times, which means they were just standing up, sitting down, standing up, sitting down all day.
First reading,
right?
second reading, division, this, that.
And then around 4 o'clock, extraordinarily, they changed gears because Simon Birmingham gets up and announces, with no warning, totally unexpectedly, out of the blue, that this was going to be his last day of Parliament. He is now retiring from Parliament. Now, I want to play a couple of clips from Mr. Birmingham because these clips are quite important. The first one is early on in his speech, and he talks about he's going to take a new direction. Just listen to how he says it. Play the clip.
Now is the right time for me, for my family, and for new career pathways. I'm excited that next year I will step into a new commercially oriented direction. You can all be relieved to know that it has nothing to do with lobbying, government relations or commentary.
So he's just promised the Senate of Australia, and there's all this twittering in the background because they know it's an issue. He's saying, I will not be involved in lobbying or government relations, right? That's what he says. The reason there's that kind of little giggle is because a lot of ex-politicians end up involved in lobbying and government relations. It's what they do. And the war pigs that I call them are the ones involved in the defence sector, right? Defence industry sector. Scott Morrison, Christopher Pyne, Arthur Sinodinos, Joel Fitzgibbon, Joe Hockey, all these people that have gone, they're now the biggest lobbyists for the war machine. You know, and you reported one today. Greg Hunt, former health minister, is now a lobbyist for a consultant to a health industry consultancy. Right, he was the health minister. Martin, what's his name? Back in the Gillard government, the member for Batman over here, former head of the ACTU. Anyway, whatever his name was. You know, he was the energy minister, right? And goes off and works for a mining company or a coal company or whatever. Like this just happens all the time. That's why they're twittering. But what you just heard there was an out and out lie. Because what is the most powerful lobby in Australia in government relations? The Banking Association. Here he is quitting Parliament to go and join the Banking Association, right? Which is nothing but a lobby. It's the lobby for the big banks, and he becomes the chief lobbyist, and it's their job to walk the corridors of power, right? To flex their muscles and tell these politicians to get back in line, which is what Anna Bligh did. This will now be his job, and he sits up there and tells a lot. He misleads the Senate blatantly to say, I won't be doing anything like that.
And this is, you know, there are supposedly legally binding guidelines on this. If you're a minister, this was the finance minister, you don't get to just go and walk into a job that's in your portfolio area. Only if it's the banks you do, and nobody says boo.
Yeah, well, you know, they have a rule that says you can't work in that area for 18 months. Christopher Pyne just completely snubbed his nose at that rule. So that's the rule, but Birmingham would say that it's been 3 years because he lost the job as finance minister, 2022 because he's been in opposition. And this is the kind of way they would spin it. Anyway, so straight out lie. He's lied to the Parliament about what he's going to do. Then he says, now people might say, well, maybe he didn't know what he was going to do. Well, give me a break. Why is he retiring early and says, I've got this new direction in the what, this is for me and my family. What does that mean? Money, money, money. Right? That's what what's good for me and my family. See, the 300 to 400 grand I've lived on as a minister and shadow minister in Parliament, no, that doesn't cut it for my family. You know, now I get some real money, thank you very much.
Maybe it's a different definition of family. You know, there's these guys in New York who aren't actually related.
That's true.
They call themselves families.
That's true. So then he says, now, how do I know that he already knew he was going to work for the Banking Association? Well, what's this line? This was a few minutes later in the speech. What's this line?
And in my new life, I look forward to advancing these interests and to helping to practically grow our trade and investment flows through our region. President, with that, we should also be clear. It's important to celebrate the profits of Australian companies, not undermine them.
So, Richard, we're supposed to applaud the profits of corporations. We're supposed to celebrate those profits, right? And can I say, like, you know, it should go without saying, who are the most profitable companies in Australia? The banks.
In the world.
In the world. Our banks are the most profitable in the world, right? So he clearly knows who he's going to go work for. And then I also thought it was sinister that he said this.
We should also be bold in the use of data to drive government efficiency and stare down the conspiracy theorists who jeopardise such productivity measures.
And of course, what he's talking about there with data is he's talking about surveillance. He's talking about the surveillance state, right? What we'll talk, and he's talking about data making government more efficient. Well, and that's, you know, the digital ID and all that kind of stuff. Don't let those conspiracy theorists get in the way. But the same argument applies to the banks. The banks, in fact, if anything, the banks are outrunning governments going down this path, right? Getting
so one thing they do spend money on.
Exactly. Right, that's the whole agenda behind getting rid of cash. They want to know everything you're doing at all times, and he clearly knows. He's practicing in that regard. He's rehearsing his lines. Now, one last point about this particular case with Birmingham. I looked it up. Do you know the Banking Association? Even though its members are the top 20 banks in Australia, the biggest 20 banks in Australia. They're all public companies, meaning they're all listed on the stock exchange.
Listed on the ASX, yeah.
And that means there's transparency associated with them. We the public can know who gets paid what in the banks, so to a degree, right? At least at the top levels.
Yeah, they put out these annual reports.
So it's all in the annual report. But the Banking Association, which represents those banks and was formed by those banks and has all those banks on its board, they do not disclose what they pay the CEO. And you got to think about that, guys. That's actually quite curious, especially given they like recruiting former politicians to that role, right? And we're going to elaborate on this in a minute because there's a certain payoff factor here, right? That you're not supposed to assume. You'll be shouted down for assuming this, but we're going to give you the case with Birmingham. But you know, they go from 200,000 or 300,000 a year, more if they're senior ministers, to what? As CEO of the Banking Association, $1 million.
Sky's the limit,
right? Exactly, the sky's the limit. Remember, I'll give you one example of what Anna Bligh did. I was there, November 2022. I and Glenn Isherwood had a meeting in Parliament House with Fraser Brinley of the Greens, the late Fraser Brinley. He's passed away since then. He was super excited because Senator Nick McKim had got the government, the Albanese government, Stephen Jones, the minister, and Jim Chalmers, the minister, the treasurer, to agree to actually finally implementing a recommendation of the Banking Royal Commission that the bank executives who are explicitly involved in this misconduct, that they know is happening, right, and they let it happen anyway, they should be, and they're on $1 million salaries, they should get $1 million fines, right? The government agreed. It was going to be legislated, you know, like the next day or the next week. Literally 24 hours later, Andy Schmuller likes talking about this, literally 24 hours later, the headline from the day before, which had said $1 million fines for bankers in the Sydney Morning Herald, 24 hours later, the headline is government drops $1 million fine for bankers because Anna Bligh called up Jim Chalmers, called up Stephen Jones and said, no, you will not. And their excuse was, we will not be able to recruit executives.
Yeah, they wouldn't be able to recruit the kind of talent they were looking for was basically
That's
what
right,
they
that's
said.
right.
That's kind of the point.
We won't be able to get the crooks we want. Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so that's how the Banking Association works. Now, so because I think this stinks to high heaven, I will do a second time what I did to Scott Morrison last year, I think it was. I'm going to refer Simon Birmingham to the National Anti-Corruption Commission. Now, I don't think it's going to look at it, but we're going to refer it and see if they do. Because there's a whole story there about yesterday in the press. There was an interesting criticism of the National Anti-Corruption Commission because all they've done is look at low-level cases at the moment, right? Little penny ante things that they claim are examples of corruption, and people are saying, "Hang on, they need to be looking at the top. What's happening at the top?" And this is the kind of stuff that happens at the top, and we're told, "Oh no, there's nothing to see there," right? So I'm going to refer Simon Birmingham to the National Anti-Corruption Commission. By the way, it's worth mentioning, Richard, in his political career, which was at state level in South Australia and then at federal level, in between the two levels, he did have already another stint in the private sector. He was the chief lobbyist of the Australian Hotels Association.
Yeah.
Now, what do we know about the Australian Hotels Association? Well, they're probably the most shameless lobbyists other than like vested interests other than the banks. They represent the pokies industry, right? So it's like how do they operate? People like Andrew Wilkie have tried to get them to get rid of television gambling ads, right? There was a Labor MP who died of cancer, and all her colleagues praised her, and she had pushed this really hard to get rid of those gambling ads on TV, which, if you're old enough to remember, didn't exist once upon a time. Now they act like TV can't survive without them, right? And this was the recommendation of an inquiry, etc. And then Albo and the Labor Party just shamelessly go, "No, we're not going to do that." Why? Because they're getting money from the Hotels Association. Birmingham used to be part of that operation as well, for what it's worth. But finally, let's just talk about, is there a payday element here? Because we came up close and personal to Birmingham in the Christine Holgate campaign. So let me just recap quickly. Christine Holgate, I think it was the 20th of October 2020, she gets ambushed out of the blue in a Senate hearing about that she'd given 2 gold watches, Cartier watches, to 4 Australia Post executives. And then that was in the morning, and then in the afternoon, that had some things that happened behind the scenes. She'd been asked to stand aside. She knew that if she stood aside, she'd never get her job back, right? And she also knew she'd done nothing wrong, so she didn't stand aside. And then when Anthony Albanese, who was in on this ambush, by the way, he's since apologised for it, so credit there, but I don't think that's enough. He was in on this ambush. He asked the question of Scott Morrison, which made Scott Morrison go off, right? And said, if she doesn't stand aside, she can go. So Scott Morrison was the Prime Minister, but the 2 most relevant ministers at the time was the Communication Minister and the Finance Minister, because they are the shareholder ministers of Australia Post. So the board, which was in charge of hiring and firing the CEO, answered to these 2 ministers. That's how the chain of command went, right? Well, one of those ministers played hard cop and one played soft cop. Hard cop was Paul Fletcher, the Communications Minister. So he's the guy who was demanding she has to go. Soft cop, who tried, if you watch, you just saw the video of Birmingham there. He tries to come across as a reasonable guy under all circumstances. And Simon Birmingham, as Finance Minister, commissioned a departmental inquiry into the watches. This was what she lost her job over. Okay, what's the story about the watches? Now, that inquiry came about because of our work, but this was not the Senate inquiry yet. This was an internal departmental inquiry. And they got a law firm called Maddox to do this inquiry into what happened. And what the law firm found was she's a tight ass for only giving $4,000 watches. That's one way to interpret the finding. What? This woman had 4 executives. The report emphasised they worked nights, weekends and public holidays for months to land a deal where they convinced the banks, the big 4 bastard banks, or 3 of them at least, to go from paying nothing for the bank at post service to paying $20 million a year. Over 5 years, it was a $220 million deal. And they'd worked their butts off to get that deal. The deal saved Australia Post, made it profitable again, saved licensed post offices, which are 2/3 of the network, the small businesses who run post offices, families, etc., they're called licensees, made them viable for the first time, right? In saving the Bank at Post service, that operates through all post offices, but there's 1,500 towns in Australia that only have Bank at Post for banking. So it saved banking services for 1,500 towns, right? That's what she did. And in her exuberance, she awarded those 4 executives very cheap Cartier watches.
Yeah, as Cartier watches go.
As Cartier watches, you can pay
It's
half
entry
a million.
level.
You can pay $500,000 plus for a Cartier watch, right? Probably even more.
Yeah, I mean, as I describe it as it's the corporate equivalent of those kids' school sports day trophies.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Made out of pot metal or whatever.
And I remember the day a politician who I don't disrespect this guy, but this was my first time meeting him, and I've got to know him better. But the day he said this, it disgusted me. He said if she had given a $50,000 bonus, no one would have cared. But the watches were a bad look. So he was arguing that a $4,000 watch, which is another an ex-banker actually said to me, Rob, you've got to understand that the point of the watches is to have something permanent to commemorate an achievement. Yeah, you give money, it just gets spent, right? This is commemorating something. That's why she did it. And this politician was, because out of political cowardice, they would have felt it easier to argue in defence of a $50,000 bonus.
Well, she had authority to give them $200,000 each, no questions asked.
And that was in the same report. So, Birmingham, he commissioned this report. It reported back to him. Based on that report, he had all the grounds he needed to reinstate her as CEO of Australia Post. That's what we were lobbying for hard at the time. What happened? Not only did he not reinstate her as the coward that he was, he then went and, so that report handed down, I think, in January or February 2021. In April 2021, the inquiry started into Christine Holgate and the first hearing, Senate inquiry. The first hearing happened. Now, her name had already been cleared by this Maddox report. So this was a more political exercise, this inquiry, but it got a lot more attention. The night before the first hearing, Simon Birmingham and Paul Fletcher appointed a new person as CEO, Paul Graham, the current CEO, to make sure that she couldn't get her job back. Now, what's happened as a result of that? Well, the first thing that's happened is the banks have had a field day. The first thing they did is they immediately slashed what they paid for Bank at Post, right, to save themselves money.
Yeah. In half at best.
Exactly. They would have breathed a massive sigh of relief that she wasn't going to be there anymore, because she was also talking about a postal bank, which they'd be forced to compete with. And if you want to see, and so this was protecting the banks. What he did was protect the banks from Christine Holgate, right? And now he's their number one lobbyist, getting paid what, $1 million, $2 million? I don't know. But if the Banking Association thinks they have the right to keep this figure secret, let's just speculate. $10 million, $20 million? I don't know.
It's not like they couldn't afford it with all the money they're ripping out of everyone else.
Exactly. Or they might just have this. One of the things with these rich entities that buy people off, they actually despise the people they buy off. They're not friends with them. They treat them with the contempt they deserve. So they like to buy off politicians, but they also like to be cheap and show what cheap prostitutes these politicians are, right? So maybe it's just $500,000. I don't know, but that's his reward for what he did to Christine Holgate.
As the standard goes, it is reasonable to assume, based on available evidence, that this is probably payment for services rendered.
Exactly. And let's look at a couple other quick aspects of this quickly. If you don't think that protecting the banks from competing with a public bank is a big deal, we'll probably do more on this in next week or something. But breaking news today is that in the Tasmanian state election, Jeremy Rockcliffe, the Liberal leader, has announced they're bringing back a state government insurance office in Tasmania. And we always used to have these things, This is to compete with the private insurers. And are the private insurers applauding it? No.
No,
They are flipping out.
Even though, like the postal bank, the whole design of it is to provide insurance to the people that the private insurers won't cover anyway.
That's right.
So what's the problem?
No, but they just, the principle of having to compete with a public entity, they cannot stand. And if that's a dry run of how they would react to our public postal bank if we ever got it up, right? If it ever got in legislation form in Parliament, they would flip out. That's why we always knew that there was a bank element behind what was done to Christine Holgate. And now the guy, one of her assassins, you know, in the alert we called him Et2 Burmo, right? One of her assassins is now the CEO of the Banking Association. And then what's the other implication of this? Well, by appointing Paul Graham to head up the post office, we are now witnessing the death of Australia Post. And if you don't believe me, I'm going to play you a video now, which was from a news report a couple of weeks ago, where they did a report on a new prototype post office they're rolling out. And the licensed post office group has been warning about this. And this is a post office that's designed to get rid of proper postal services and make Australia Post nothing but a parcels delivery service, right? When if they were a bank, they could afford to provide all the services they always do. The current CEO, who thinks totally opposite of Christine Holgate, is just talking about making every post office one of these.
Thank you, James. Australia Post is delivering a major change to the humble post office thanks to a boom in parcel demand. Say goodbye to snail mail with the next generation of stores opening in Fitzroy, focusing on parcels. The redesigned location is promising to make sending, collecting and returning online orders faster and more convenient.
The number one reason why a customer comes into a post office is to collect a parcel. So it's logical that we make that process and experience even more seamless than ever. And we're doing that through extended trading hours.
The new store design will be trialled at selected locations before more stores are rolled out nationally.
So there you go. That's the consequences of what they did to Christine Holgate, right? And one of her assassins is now in the Banking Association. So we will continue this fight for a public post office bank because we're going to take these corrupt bastards down. I don't care how pleasantly they present themselves. You know, they're toxic individuals in reality. The impact, the destruction they're doing to Australia. Finally, Richard, we're running out of time, so let's move on to this quickly because this is more of an update from last week. But you have written a very interesting article. Australia is under military occupation. In your article this week in the Alert. And you can always subscribe to the Australian Alert Service. This is where all our research is published. Why people call us a think tank. You headlined it, Albanese hastens NATO absorption of Australia. So we want to talk a bit about the bases in Australia, but first, we've had this NATO summit. What came out of it for us?
Yeah, so they sent all gung-ho, stars and stripes Richard Marles over there to sign off on this stuff and grin like an idiot in the
Stars
photos.
and stripes, yep.
So Australia has for a long time been a NATO, first a partner and then an enhanced partner and then basically integrated by the description of the top brass of the Australian Defence Force themselves. We're essentially a member in every practical respect of NATO already. Everything's designed to mesh in with the US military interoperability. Miles called it interchangeability when he first came into office a few years ago.
Yep.
And everybody went, well, hang on. I said, well, at least he was open about it. So they've gone and now signed onto this thing with the NATO's internal in-house procurement agency.
Right.
To streamline industrial bases and processes and, give Australian manufacturers access to the NATO market and vice versa. Well, I mean, all of our major military manufacturers here are already foreign, what they call primes. We don't have any domestic ones. Which sounds, if you took it by itself, it'd sound quite innocuous, but people need to understand what this is. And the context is that, what NATO actually is, because the context of this is, remember that Anthony Albanese's already agreed to have Australia designated as a quote-unquote domestic source for US defence production under their Defence Production Act. They've brought in all these American advisors to the military. They brought new American tech companies and so on. And what we hear from our contacts is you basically, if you want to get anything done, any kind of business, even cleaning toilets for the Defence Department or any of its properties, you've basically got to go through the Americans now.
And before you go on, I mean, just for the viewer, just consider the implications of that for our sovereignty. We are becoming less and less able to disagree with the Americans on strategy and military decisions every day.
Yeah, so now at the moment, all of our major weapon systems and the ones that we're supposed to be buying, the multiple launch rocket systems, all these things, they're all controlled. They're not just supplied by American companies, they're controlled by the American military.
Yeah.
Like the F-35 fighters is a classic, right? The black box systems that we're not even allowed to repair. They have to be sent back, pulled apart, bits sent back to America, unless they authorise the local subsidiary to do it here, right? But the Australian government doesn't get those tech transfers like we used to do with, say, the F-111 program back in the day, if people remember that one. And so this NATO streamlining of the supply chains and industrial base basically means NATO STANAGs, standardised agreements. And they have these on everything, political processes, military force structure, but in this case it refers to this basically means Australia is, as I said, being absorbed into that NATO ecosystem, if you like, which means that they're going to get first dibs on everything. They're going to get the say over whatever, what gets made here and what doesn't. We're only going to be able to get, because, times are hard, right? You can't just be making all this stuff on spec. This is the next step in converting Australia into permanently entrapping us in this system, so that you think of it like Microsoft Windows for World War III, right?
Or Apple.
Yeah, it's a virtual monopoly, and it sets the rules, and you just cop it.
Okay.
That's what this is.
So there's the iTunes industrial complex. Shouldn't laugh. So this is already happening now, combined with what's already happening now with our bases that we talked about, not our bases, US military bases here that we talked about last week, which are under this thing called the Force Posture Agreement, by which the Americans basically have total say over what they do in their bases in Australia.
Yeah. The government doesn't even want to know. They've said so.
So let's talk now about Mike Pizzullo, and he clearly must be working with Andrew Hastie. They are now pushing to take this even further in quite a sinister way, really. I won't play the clip because it takes too long, but last week he gave an interview on Mike Pizzullo gave an interview on ABC 7:30, where he described some of what we talked about. We described his interview last week, where he was saying, he's basically trying to make people think that there's something, there's some limitations to the way we deal with the Americans now. We need to fix that up, but he's pushing for something much that integrates us much firmer, more firmly. Tell us how that works.
Yeah, so he's pushing this idea, and Hastie's talking about the same kind of their axiom in the classical sense. The assumption behind all of this is that the risk is worth it. Pizzullo has said so straight up, that we have yes, these bases here makes us a nuclear target. Yes, the Americans operate them effectively without our consent, but the government approves of it de facto, right? They call it full knowledge and concurrence, except for whether they've got nuclear weapons in their B-52s. Penny Wong says she doesn't want to know about that.
That's right.
Won't ask. But so on the false premise that the ANZUS Treaty, the 1951 Australia, New Zealand, US security treaty, obliges us to act together to meet, anytime the Americans are in a fight in the Pacific area, which if the Americans pick a fight over Taiwan, with China over Taiwan, that's in the Pacific area, then we'd naturally, that treaty would oblige us to support them anyway. So what he said, and it doesn't, but I'll get to that.
Yeah.
What he's saying is, well, if we had a NATO style, if we made ANZUS into a formal warfighting treaty like NATO, that would give us, joint command of as if any NATO country has joint command over anything. Pull the other one, Who believes this stuff? But it's a lie anyway, because what ANZUS does is obliges the countries to consult together on any threat to any one of them, and if there is an attack on any one of them, to act together to meet the common threat. But that's predicated on such action being, it says, that nothing else in the treaty changes or shall be so interpreted to change any party's, so that is Australia, US or New Zealand, obligation under the UN Charter to uphold peace and security, which means that if you start the fight, you're on your own.
Yeah, exactly.
And actually NATO's Article 5 even says the same thing. It's collective defence.
So what you're saying though is, given that ANZUS is looser than Pizzullo has talked about, given that under ANZUS we've already got things like the Force Posture Agreement, AUKUS, interchangeability and interoperability, and this latest NATO defence supply chain stuff, which is already a total undermining of our sovereignty.
Yeah, it's a complete straight.
What Pizzullo is saying is we'll make that even worse, lock us in the name of, this is now an equal for warfighting alliance.
Because China threat that none of them can ever define. But there is still an out at the moment. And he even puts up an ultimatum at the end of an article that he wrote for The Australian and for ASPI, joint published. We're saying, well, because these agreements go back before, like ANZUS is 51, there are agreements that the Menzies government made that set up things like, what Pine Gap has become and communication stations that some of them still operate, others don't, to do with submarines and so forth. But he says, well, you either accept that we're on America's side no matter what anyway, or you can all of those things and we go out on our own. And we're like, at last, you're talking our language, Mike. Right? He thinks that's the big gotcha.
Yeah. He thinks that's the boogeyman.
Yeah. Now that might work. That argument might cow the likes of Albanese.
But it didn't cow the Kiwis in the 80s when they pulled out of ANZUS, right? Anyway, no, look, it's a joke, but we're going to keep on this theme because this is happening hot and heavy at the moment, and it's all an attack on our sovereignty. And the reason the headline is Australia's under military occupation is because I spoke to the former US ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Chaz Freeman, who was also the guy that interpreted for Richard Nixon when he went to China in the 1970s. So he's an older gentleman, but if you look him up, look up Chaz Freeman, Chas Freeman on YouTube. You can see lots of interviews. He's a very smart guy. He made the point to me that the US bases in Australia are operating under the same legal framework as America's bases in Japan and Germany after World War II. And they were an occupation.
Yep, it was just official then.
Yep. All right, we are out of time. I hope we haven't gone over time. It's hard to follow the clock sometimes. Richard, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Robbie.
Thanks to the viewer. Quickly, one last thing, just to finish this off. This week, the Australia Institute took out this full-page ad in the Canberra Times, showing they're on the same side as us, demanding an AUKUS inquiry. We need to have an AUKUS inquiry so we can raise all this stuff, have it aired properly, and that's going to be a big fight to get that to happen. So good on the Australia Institute for doing that. We'll say goodbye. See you next week, viewer.